Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we'll explore the shocking moment a powerful CEO walks away from everything, his career, his family's expectations, just to choose love and a completely different life. What could possibly make a man give up it all? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls of James's office, glowing with quiet authority, just like the life he had built. Inside, everything was immaculate. The polished glass desk, the neatly stacked reports, the silent weight of responsibility hanging in the air. James sat alone in his chair, not moving, his eyes fixed on a document in front of him, though he hadn't read a single line for the past 10 minutes. The title at the top read Quarterly Growth Strategy, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Slowly, he leaned back and exhaled, the kind of breath that carried years of pressure with it. He opened the drawer beside him and took out a small photograph. His fingers paused the moment they touched it. In the picture, Tu Diep was laughing, her head slightly tilted, while little Nee clung to her arm with a bright, innocent smile. The contrast between that simple moment and the world he was currently sitting in hit him harder than any boardroom argument ever could. "What am I doing?" he murmured under his breath. His thumb gently brushed over the image, and for the first time that day, his expression softened. For years, he had been the perfect CEO, decisive, strategic, untouchable. But now, that identity felt distant, almost choj. He looked around the office again, at the city that once symbolized success. "This was never the dream," he whispered. After a long pause, something in his eyes shifted. The hesitation disappeared, replaced by something steady, something certain. James pulled a blank sheet of paper toward him. The pen hovered for just a second before he began to write. Each word came out clean and deliberate, as if he had already written it 1,000 times in his mind. When he finished, he signed his name without hesitation. There was no dramatic pause, no second guessing. He placed the resignation letter neatly in the center of the desk and leaned back again. This time, his breathing was calm. The decision had been made. The boardroom was nothing like his office. It was louder, colder, filled with voices that carried power and expectation. Executives and shareholders sat around the long table, their expressions ranging from curious to impatient. When James walked in, the room gradually fell silent. He didn't rush. He didn't try to control the atmosphere like he usually did. Instead, he simply took his seat, placed a folder in front of him, and looked around at everyone. "I'll keep this brief," he said, his tone steady but not cold. "I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately." For a moment, no one reacted. It was as if the words hadn't fully registered. Then, everything erupted at once. "What do you mean, stepping down?" one executive demanded, standing up abruptly. "This is absurd," another voice cut in. "Do you realize what this will do to the company?" Murmurs spread across the room, sharp and relentless. Some people leaned forward, others shook their heads in disbelief. But James didn't react to any of it. He remained still, his hands resting calmly on the table. "I understand your concerns," he said, his voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. "But this decision isn't impulsive. I've given it serious thought." "Serious thought?" someone scoffed. "Walking away from everything you built is serious thought?" James met their gaze without flinching. "Yes, because for the first time I'm choosing something that actually matters to me." The room quieted slightly, though the tension remained thick. Before anyone else could speak, another voice entered the conversation, deeper, sharper, filled with authority. "James!" Everyone turned. Mr. Juan stood near the entrance, his expression dark, his presence commanding instant silence. He walked slowly toward the table, his eyes locked onto his son. "Explain yourself," he said, each word measured but heavy. James didn't look away. "I already have." "No, Mr." Juan replied, his voice tightening. You've made a reckless announcement. That's not the same as an explanation. A faint ripple of discomfort passed through the room. This wasn't just a business conflict anymore, it was personal. "I'm done living a life that isn't mine," James said quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. Mr. Huan's jaw tightened. "This company is your responsibility." "And my life is mine," James replied, his tone firm but controlled. "You're throwing away your future." "I'm choosing it." The two stared at each other, neither willing to step back. The tension between them was almost tangible, pressing down on everyone in the room. After a long moment, Mr. Huan let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You think this is freedom? You think walking away makes you stronger?" James stood up slowly. "No, I think staying when I know it's wrong would make me weaker." Silence fell again, heavier than before. Without another word, James picked up his folder and walked toward the door. No one tried to stop him this time. The shock had settled into something else. Uncertainty, maybe even a reluctant understanding. As he stepped out of the boardroom, the noise behind him resumed, but it no longer mattered. The hallway outside was quiet, almost eerily so compared to the chaos he had just left behind. James walked steadily, his expression unreadable, until a voice stopped him. "James!" He paused. Mr. Huan stood a few steps behind him, his presence just as imposing as before, but there was something different now, something less controlled. "Turn around," his father said. James did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt larger than the length of the hallway. "You still have time to fix this," Mr. Huan said finally. "Go back in there. Take back what you said." James shook his head. "I can't." "You won't," his father corrected sharply. James held his gaze. "No, I can't, because if I do, I'll be choosing your life again, not mine." Mr. Huan's expression hardened. "And what life is that? Running off to a woman and abandoning everything?" "I'm not abandoning anything," James replied. "I'm choosing what matters." "Love," his father said, almost scoffing. "You think that's enough?" James didn't hesitate. "Yes." The answer landed harder than any argument. For a brief second, something flickered in Mr. Huan's eyes, anger, disappointment, maybe even something deeper. But it was gone just as quickly. "You'll regret this," he said coldly. "Maybe," James admitted, "but at least it'll be my mistake." That was the end of it. James lowered his head slightly, a quiet gesture of respect, then turned and walked away. This time, he didn't stop. When he arrived home later that day, the atmosphere was completely different. The familiar warmth of the house wrapped around him the moment he stepped inside. His mother was in the living room, arranging flowers, and she looked up with a gentle smile that immediately faded when she saw his expression. "James, what's wrong?" He set his bag down slowly. "Mom, I need to tell you something." She put the flowers aside, her concern growing. "What is it?" "I resigned," he said simply. Her eyes widened. "You... what?" "I stepped down as CEO today." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to understand what he had just said. "Why?" she asked softly. James took a deep breath. "Because I don't want that life anymore." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed from behind. Mr. Huan entered the room, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere again. He didn't say anything, but his silence spoke volumes. James looked between them. "I'm leaving," he continued. "I'm going to live with Tu Diep." His mother's hand trembled slightly. "You're leaving? For how long?" James hesitated, then gave a small, sad smile. "I don't know." The room fell into a heavy silence, filled with emotions none of them could fully express. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James didn't answer right away. He wanted to. He really did. But the truth was he didn't know what the future would look like anymore. So instead, he just smiled again, soft, uncertain, but sincere. And that silence said everything. The next morning arrived quieter than any morning James had ever experienced in that house. There were no urgent calls, no assistants waiting outside, no schedule dictating every minute of his day. Just silence and the weight of what he was about to do. A suitcase stood by the door. His mother was already there, as if she hadn't slept at all. She held onto the edge of the table, her fingers slightly trembling, her eyes fixed on him the moment he stepped into the room. "You're leaving now?" she asked softly. James nodded. "Yeah." For a brief second, neither of them moved. Then she walked toward him and pulled him into a tight embrace. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. "Don't forget to eat properly and don't disappear completely, all right?" James let out a quiet breath, his arms wrapping around her. "I won't, Mom." Behind them, Mr. Juan stood near the doorway. He hadn't said a word since the night before. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, but his presence filled the space with unspoken tension. James gently pulled away from his mother and looked at him. "Dad." There was a pause, a long one, but Mr. Hone didn't respond. Not with words, not even with a nod. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond James, as if acknowledging him would make everything too real. James lowered his head slightly, a quiet, respectful gesture, and turned toward the door. He picked up his suitcase, the sound of the wheels against the floor echoing louder than it should have. "James." He stopped. It was his father's voice. Slowly, he turned around. Mr. Hahn still didn't step forward. He didn't soften, but this time he was looking directly at his son. "If you walk out that door," he said, his tone controlled but heavy, "you don't get to come back and pretend nothing happened." James held his gaze. "I understand." Another pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, Mr. Hohn's hand tightened. "Do whatever you want," he said, turning away. "You always do." It wasn't approval, but it wasn't a command either, and somehow that made it even harder. James gave a small nod, even though his father wasn't looking anymore. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. The car was already waiting. As it pulled away, James glanced back through the window. His mother stood in the doorway, one hand covering her mouth, trying to hold back tears. Behind her, the figure of his father remained still, distant, almost like a shadow. The house grew smaller. Then it disappeared, and just like that, the life he had always known was behind him. The journey to Tu Diep's home felt longer than it actually was. The city slowly gave way to quieter roads, then to open spaces, and finally to the soft, endless green of the bamboo forest. The air itself seemed different, lighter, calmer, untouched by the noise he had left behind. When the car stopped, James didn't get out immediately. He looked down at his hands. No expensive watch, no documents, no weight of expectation. Just himself. After a moment, he stepped out, pulling his suitcase behind him. The wooden house stood ahead, simple and quiet, surrounded by tall bamboo swaying gently in the breeze. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't powerful, but it felt real. James walked up to the door and paused. Then he knocked. Inside, footsteps approached. The door opened, and Tu Diep stood there, frozen in place the moment she saw him. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. "James," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave a small, nervous smile. "Hey!" Her eyes moved from his face to the suitcase beside him, then back again. What are you doing here?" James took a breath. "I left." She blinked. "Left what?" "Everything." The word hung in the air between them. "I resigned," he continued. "I left the company. I left the city." He hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "I came here." Tu Diep stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "James, you can't just..." She stopped herself, shaking her head. Do you even realize what you're saying? I do. No, you don't, she said, her voice trembling slightly. That's your life, your career, your everything. And you're not? He asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. I didn't come here on impulse, James continued, his voice steady. I've thought about this for a long time, and I realized something. None of that means anything if I'm not where I want to be. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't let the tears fall. And you think that's here? I know it is. Silence, the kind that stretches, that forces every emotion to surface. You gave up everything. For me? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. James shook his head slightly. Not just for you, for the life I want, for the person I want to be. He looked at her, completely open, completely certain. But yes, you're a big part of that. That was it. The last barrier. Tu Diep's composure finally broke. She turned away for a second, her hand covering her mouth as tears slipped through despite her effort to hold them back. Hey! James stepped forward instinctively but stopped himself, unsure if he should. She wiped her tears quickly, then turned back to him. And without another word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, tightly, as if letting go wasn't an option. James froze for a split second, then slowly held her back, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. I don't know what happens next, she whispered. Neither do I, he admitted. But we'll figure it out. She nodded against him. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The days that followed were different, completely different. The first morning, James woke up to the sound of birds instead of alarms. He stepped outside and stood there for a while, just taking it in, the bamboo, the air, the stillness. Don't just stand there, Tu Diep called from behind him. If you're going to stay, you have to help. He turned, slightly confused. Help with what? She raised an eyebrow. Everything. And that was how it started. James, the former CEO, now stood awkwardly in the yard holding tools he didn't know how to use. So, what do I do with this? He asked, examining a simple farming tool like it was some kind of complex machine. Tu Diep sighed, trying not to smile. Give it here. Over the next few days, he learned. Slowly, clumsily. He tried to carry water and nearly spilled half of it. He attempted to fix a wooden fence and made it worse. He followed little Nee around, completely unprepared for her endless energy. Careful! He called as she ran past him, laughing. You're too slow, she teased. Hey, I'm trying! But something changed. The frustration he expected never came. Instead, there was laughter. There was warmth. There was a kind of peace he had never known before. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the three of them sat outside the wooden house, Nee leaned against him, half asleep. Tu Diep sat across from them, watching quietly. You're getting better, she said. James smirked. That's a generous assessment. She smiled softly. No, I mean it. He looked around. The simple home, the quiet surroundings, the small family they had somehow become. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something settle inside him. Not ambition, not pressure, just contentment. I think, he said slowly. This might actually be the right decision. Tu Diep didn't respond right away. She didn't need to, because the way she looked at him already said everything. And as the night quietly wrapped around them, James realized something he had never fully understood before. Happiness wasn't something you built in skyscrapers. Sometimes, it was something you found in the simplest places, right where you chose to be. James walks away from his powerful role as CEO after realizing that success without love feels empty and meaningless. Sitting alone in his office, he chooses to resign and face the consequences of that decision. In a tense boardroom meeting, he shocks everyone, including his father, Mr. Hwan, who strongly opposes him. Despite the pressure, James stands firm and leaves everything behind. At home, He says an emotional goodbye to his parents, accepting the uncertainty ahead. He then travels to Tu Diep's simple wooden house and confesses he gave up everything to be there. Together, they begin a humble life, filled with warmth, small struggles, and genuine happiness, proving that true fulfillment comes from love, not power or status. They support each other while adjusting to new challenges and slowly discover peace in everyday moments together as a small family.